We are live, all right. All right, we're gonna get this started. Thank you for all coming tonight, those of you who are here live and those of you on Zoom and Facebook. Welcome tonight to the Asset Zoning Bylaw Rewrite and Update presented by the Zoning Bylaw Committee. The purpose of tonight is to give the first rollout, the first public rollout of the articles that'll be presented at the Springtown meeting, which is on May 1, correct? May 1. My name is Tom Callahan. I am the chair of the Zoning Bylaw Committee. I'm also the chair of the Planning Board. I want to begin tonight, if we could put up this slide, with the Zoning Committee. I'd like to introduce the Bylaw Committee. It's been pointed out I was remiss at doing that at some past forums, so I want them all to show their smiling faces tonight. Again, I'm Tom Callahan. I am one of the two representatives from the Planning Board. Let's leave the next slide. Also with us tonight is Clark Brewer, the other representative from the Planning Board. And then we have Jack Creighton, chair of the Select Board, is also that board's representative. Not with us this evening is Cassie Malatesta, who is the representative of the Master Plan Implementation Committee. And then we have Dave Farag, who is our citizen at large. Our staff is, Director of Planning is Lauren Lind, as everyone knows, not here this evening. Cassandra Thayer, our Assistant Town Planner. And then out on Zoom tonight is our invaluable help from our Town Council's office, the Honorable Judith Cutler, who is a former Chief Justice of the Land Court. And if anybody's not familiar with the Land Court, it is the trial court that specializes in real estate related issues and most notably zoning appeals. And Judge Cutler has been helping us with actually writing these articles and the new bylaw. I also wanted to give some thanks to the prior zoning working group members, Katie Dugan, Woody Chittick from the Zoning Board, Peter Pescatori, and Paul Caleri. The work of the prior bylaw working group has gotten us to this point tonight, and their help was immeasurable. Slide, please. So I'm just going to begin tonight with just a little brief overview, since the town hasn't comprehensively dealt with the bylaw in a number of years, just to explain the process a little bit. So the working group is appointed by the Board of Selectmen. We were the successor to the bylaw working group appointed by the Selectmen last summer, and we are taking the charge as the quarterbacks of drafting the rewrite and the update of the bylaw. And we are getting our professional assistance from our town staff and from our town council. The planning board is giving ongoing input during the process. And next week on Wednesday, the 8th, in this room and also by a hybrid meeting, the planning board will be conducting its formal statutory review of these bylaws. The planning board has a role under Chapter 48, Section 5, to have a public hearing, hear what the bylaws are about, and then to make a recommendation for passage or not. The Zoning Board of Appeals is giving us ongoing input during this process. We will also be seeking their recommendation for town meeting, likewise for the Select Board and for the Advisory Committee, as is traditionally done for every town meeting. Next slide, please. So just a brief overview of zoning law in Massachusetts. The state zoning law is Chapter 40A of the Mass General Laws. That is a law we must all comply with. Somewhat related to that, but different, is the subdivision control law, which is found in Chapter 41. And then we have state court decisions from our Supreme Judicial Court, the highest court, the appeals court, the land court, and the Superior Court. The land court and the Superior Court are trial courts, which will be the first line for any appeal of any zoning decision from the local level. A number of the changes, the housekeeping changes we're making with Judge Cutler's assistance, is because of court decisions that have come out in recent years. And then we have local zoning bylaws, and every city and town in the state has them. And they are subject, again, to the overall state statutory and decisional framework. But a zoning bylaw will allow communities to develop their own core provisions. And by the core, we refer to the creation of districts, the regulation of what uses are allowed, and dimensional requirements. And each community can do that uniquely in its own zoning bylaw, as long as they keep working within the overall framework of state law. And in Cohasset, for zoning and land use, we first start with our building inspector, who is currently John Hallen. He is designated as the zoning enforcement officer, and he is the person who on a day-to-day basis administers and interprets the zoning bylaw. He issues building permits and occupancy permits, and he is the sole person who can issue fines for violations of the zoning bylaw. Our Concom, for example, is a board that, as a board, can issue fines. The zoning board and the planning board cannot do that. We had checked that, and the way the state law is written, it is left exclusively to the building commissioner to decide if fines are going to be issued for any violations. So the boards can make recommendations to him, but it is up to him. Then we have other land use laws that are not zoning bylaws that govern different aspects of land use and require permits. We have wetlands and stormwater management that's managed by the Conservation Commission, septic systems that are managed by the Board of Health, scenic roads, it's a non-zoning bylaw that the planning board administers, and then water and sewer commissions with their permits are in fact regulating land use by granting permits for those connections. And then our day-to-day staff that helps with all of this, again, Lauren Lind is our Director of Planning, and Cassandra Thayer is our Assistant Town Planner. And just to give a brief overview of history, zoning came into effect in Massachusetts for the first time as a state law in 1920, and there were substantial amendments written in 33, 54, and 75. Our current Chapter 40A was rewritten in 1975, and that also dictated a number of changes to local bylaws, including our own. Zoning, then the first state subdivision control law was earlier. It started in Boston and then passed more statewide later on in the mid-20th century. Zoning and land use control was originally an urban phenomenon. It then became more popular in suburbs as they grew after World War II. And this is true in Massachusetts and nationwide, and we were no exception. In 1954, Cohasset adopted the subdivision control law, and in 1955, we adopted our first zoning bylaw. And I just pointed out as a point of interest, it was done at a special town meeting, not in an annual town meeting. The zoning bylaw, as everybody knows who's a regular attendee at town meeting, sees a change or a proposal almost at every meeting. Some of these are substantive. We've had a number of articles added to the bylaw over the years. Some of them are simply housekeeping. Some of them are to keep up with court decisions. But the true core of the bylaw, districts, uses, dimensions, haven't been amended since 1986. We did a significant change in 1969 when we switched frontages from what would be more traditionally suburban type frontage to what we have today. 78 was our response to the change in state law and the adoption of the current Chapter 40A. And then in 86, there were some changes made to the table of area regulations. But with all the changes we've had since and so many add-ons, we have not really looked at this core in quite a long time. You can see that we spaced out from 55 to 69 to 78 to 86. And we have learned as a committee from experts that perhaps a town should be looking at its bylaw every 5 to 10 years, certainly 10, but we have not really done so, and we're quite overdue. So the next slide. That leads us into why we're doing this. Is first of all, it's just simply time for us to be taking a look at the bylaw comprehensively from top to bottom. Cohasset is a much different community today than it was in 86, and from 86 what it was in 55. So it's just good practice that we take a look at it. Reorganization and housekeeping is desperately needed because we have added a number of articles over the years. We have created some conflicts in terms. There's definitions all over the place. It's kind of an organizational mess. And the focus of this town meeting here in the spring is very heavy on the housekeeping. There's a few things of substance that we're going to discuss tonight, but we're doing heavy on the housekeeping for this to set the stage for other changes in the bylaw that may come in the fall. We want to try to increase the user friendliness of it, and again, we need to start thinking about how development patterns are working today versus what they were when these provisions were first written, and think about what changes we might need to do. All right. Now, our bylaw is currently, a few years ago, the town retained a third-party app system. It's called E360. A lot of towns in Massachusetts have adopted the E360 system. You can go online to Cohasset, type in Cohasset E360, you will come up to the link. And there you can see all of our bylaws, the non-zoning bylaws, which are we refer to as the general bylaws, the zoning bylaw, which is chapter 300, and then the subdivision control law is, after that is chapter 325. Right now we have 22 articles in the zoning bylaw, and within each article are sections. The originals are a lot of what we're going to be dealing with tonight, 1 to 8, 12, and 13. Two of them, Article 16, are no longer in effect. Article 16 is the senior overlay district that was repealed a town meeting or two ago. And Article 21, which was the moratorium on marijuana-related uses, that had expired by its own time link that was built into it. There is one article, Article 17, the transportation-oriented district, that really applies only to one property in town. And a key portion of our bylaw that's very important and part of the core is that we have a table of use regulations. This dictates what is allowed and not allowed in each of our zoning districts, either as of right, by special permit, or prohibited. And then we have the table of area regulation, which is all the dimensions, frontage, setbacks, height, lot coverage, and things of that sort. We have 3 residential districts in total, residents are A, B, and C. We have 6 commercial districts. We have 5 overlay districts and 1 open space district. So during this rewrite, again, the bylaw, the predecessor bylaw working group and this bylaw committee have now been working on this for a little over 2 years. We did, with the working group, when we were doing a lot of work without the assistance of counsel, we did a lot of research, we did a lot of comparison and benchmarking with other communities' bylaws to see how we measure up and to seek out some ideas. When KP Law came on board to help us this past summer, they did a very comprehensive diagnostic of our whole bylaw. They went through every article, pointed out problems with language, where it was confusing, pointed out places where you might need some change, typos, and then most importantly, they were to point out areas where we need to be more in compliance with developing state law. So that has been an invaluable tool that we have started from. Our members have come up with ideas. We have had input from other town boards. And as many of you know, we conducted 3 forums this past fall. We will be conducting others in the future as we look towards the fall town meeting articles. And so we're getting input from anywhere and everywhere we can. The purpose of tonight is to bring this out early before town meeting while we still have opportunities to make necessary changes before the warrant goes to print, and to have this sort of a give and take rather than have the up or down vote setting of a town meeting. Right now we are proposing a 2-step process with the transition from the working group to the current committee. We did lose some time. We didn't bring forward anything this past fall's town meeting, but we are into a 2-step process where we will be here in this spring with changes to Articles 1, 13, 3, 6, 8, 12, and some of Article 2, which is our definitions. The changes to articles we will deal with in the fall will probably beget more definitional changes, and we'll get to those. In the fall, we'll be getting into some of the more meatier parts of the bylaw. We will be dealing with Article 4, Article 5. Article 7 is parking. We just want to make sure that our parking regulations are up to the state of the art. 9, 10, 11, 14, 15. 15 is accessory dwelling units, which was the subject of one of our forums this past fall. 17 was that transportation district. 18 specifically deals with the village. 19 and 20 is wind and solar. And then 22 is the overlay district that's down in the harbor that's led to the hotel project that's under construction right now. Article 4 and 5 are the cores, the uses and dimensions, and that any changes, and again, nothing has been cast in stone about that yet, but any changes to those two articles are probably then going to dictate changes to the others. Some may stay, some may go. We may do a lot of consolidation. So that's really going to be dictated on how we want to redo the charts of the table of uses and the table of dimensions. For new initiatives, right now we're looking at the fact that we have to address the so-called MBTA housing mandate. That's a new initiative from state law that we talked about at one of our earlier forums that basically is telling any town that has an MBTA station that within a certain distance from that station, you have to allow multifamily housing as of right. And there are certain incentives to force towns to do that. So we do have to address that. Again, the subject of a past forum, we are probably going to try to deal with some climate-related initiatives to deal with climate change and resiliency. And then at the end of this, when it's all done, the current 22 article structure may be reorganized and moved around and just modernized and consolidated. So that's right now on tap for the fall. For tonight, we're going to go a little out of order. We're going to deal with Articles 1 and 13 first, then 3, 6, 12, 2, and 8. A lot of this is administrative and housekeeping work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on them. All the materials have been put on the Zoning Bylaw Committee's webpage, on the town webpage. Not only the actual warrant articles themselves, as they're currently written, but we've also put side-by-side comparisons of the new versus the old. That creates 52 slides. I do not intend to go through 52 slides tonight. But where we have some of the more substantive change that we want to discuss tonight and focus on is in Article 2 and one of our definitional changes, and then Article 8, which deals with non-conforming lots and structures. So, without further ado, does anybody have any questions about history or management of the zoning bylaw, the law, or anything about the law that they have from the opening presentation? All right. All right, Article 1 is currently titled the scope of the bylaw. What is proposed here, as you will see, is moving things around, consolidation, replacement. Some of the provisions are the same, just being moved in another number. And we'll go to the next page too. This is really an administrative thing, and it's just being cleaned up with the language to make sure that we are in compliance with what state law and making the correct references to state law. We have added, you'll see in the purposes of the bylaw, there's a list A through F in the current bylaw, and we're adding 3 more purposes. One is to preserve natural resources and prevent pollution. Second is to encourage diverse housing opportunities. That has been an objective as set forth in the master plan and in our master housing plan as well. And then the third would be to encourage the most appropriate use of land in accordance with the objectives and the recommendations of the master plan. The master plan having only come on board since 2018. So there's really not a lot of substance other than that. Article 13 is being grouped in with this article that will make these changes to Article 1. Article 13 has 2 small paragraphs to it. They're completely unnecessary, and Article 13 is being proposed for deletion in its entirety. We can go up with a couple of other slides. Oh, okay. Article 3 in the bylaw is where we describe our districts and where we have the town map. Now, there's a note over there on the left that there's a possibility that this article will be indefinitely postponed at town meeting. And the reason being is that we're not making any substantive changes here. Renaming districts, consolidating districts, none of that is happening. Again, this is more of a housekeeping, cleanup, and reorganization. If there's going to be any changes in the districts themselves, that would come in the fall with any changes that we make to the table of uses or the table of dimensions. But we are also trying to update the map. The bylaw's current reference is to an older version of the map that does not include our existing transportation-oriented district, our solar overlay district, or the Whitney Woods Rail Trail, which was rezoned to open space a couple years ago. If we do not get that map updated by the time town meeting rolls along, we're going to have to postpone this article to the fall, and then we'll be dealing with all the changes to Article 3 all at one time. Unfortunately, we do not have a town engineer at the moment, but we are hopeful that from an outside contractor who's done the old map that we can get the new one ready in time. So there is a chance that this will pass, will go forward, and there's a chance it'll be postponed. Next couple of slides, we'll go to Article 6. Okay, so Article 6 is our provision of the bylaw that deals with signs. And as it's noted, there'll be 2 parts of this. They'll be voted together as just one vote. Again, the textual changes in Article 6, housekeeping, consolidation, being clear about political signs, and most importantly, we had not had in our current bylaw a regulation of the height of a sign, and we are taking care of that. If we can go down a little bit further, the second part of this is to, and we're not doing anything here to change the kinds of signs that are, next page if we could, please. Go down to the definitions. It's a lot of it is just moving things around and rewording it, but some of the second part of this where there are some changes are into certain definitions that we have. And most importantly, and I think it's on the next page, is we are looking to just clarify the definitions for political and non-commercial types of signs. And Judge Cutler, I can see you're up on the screen on Zoom. If I'm not mistaken, that is to bring us more into compliance with case law from the state.
That's correct. Actually, from federal decisions, yes.
So again, so the sign bylaw, it's very long. We describe an awful lot of signs, but we're not making, other than that, putting in a height restriction that should have always been there. We're not making any real substantive changes, but just clarifying one definition to make sure that we're in compliance with state law. Anybody has any questions as I fly through some of these less ones, let me know. We'll certainly entertain them. All right, so then let's go to Article 12. Article 12 is our it's titled as our administration and enforcement section. And in this article, this is where we describe the building inspector and his duties. We describe the zoning board and what it does. We have added a description of what the planning board is, since the planning board is not identified or defined in the zoning bylaw. It is somewhere in the general bylaws, but moved in a little description of the planning board and its duties. This is also the place where we describe some of the basic permits that the zoning board and the planning board deal with a special permit, variance, and site plan review. One of the things in enforcement, if I may skip up, and laser pointers don't work on this, but I'll do the old-fashioned one. We are increasing the fine that could be issued under the zoning bylaw. As I mentioned before, it's only the building inspector and zoning enforcement officer who can issue any fines. Currently, the fine is at $100 per violation per day. The state law maximum is $300. We are bringing it up to that state law allowed maximum. And just to note, in comparison, the Conservation Commission, under its separate bylaw, already has a $300 a day maximum and has had that for a number of years. So, yeah.
Are there a couple of examples you could give everyone for what violations would be finable offenses?
Spitballing would be somebody who starts building without the appropriate permit, would be subject to a shutdown order. Well, on the planning board a year and a half, 2 years ago, we had a project that had an application. Well, basically, they didn't file for a permit, and they filed for it after the fact. And actually, the planning board recommended that a fine, and a pretty substantial one, since it had been a long number of days that had passed since this mistake was corrected. That was recommended, and that's actually when we researched whether the planning board and the zoning board could ever have its own authority to issue a fine, but state law prohibits that. So that was an example. So it usually will come in the fact that either you start work without a permit, or the building inspector is doing his inspections around town and you are operating with a permit but are not following the terms of that permit. That would also bring you both liable to a stop work order until you fix it, go back for whatever permissions you needed, but it can also subject you to a financial fine as well. And it's the same way as, as the Concom fine system works as well. The other, if I can scroll down again, so most of this is consolidating, cleaning up. At least the first two sections are being consolidated. The description of the special permit process is not substantively different. The description of the variance process is not. The description of the site plan review process, which is a process that only the planning board handles, and it is a process that applies to commercial properties only, has been updated. And Judge Cutler, if I may, I'm going to ask you to maybe to briefly explain what the change there is for and why.
Oh, certainly. Basically, the current site plan review is rather limited in scope and to which particular commercial properties or uses it applies to. This new provision is much broader in scope, and it generally applies to any time there is a substantial alteration or new construction of a building to house a new use that is commercial in nature or multifamily. And also would apply if there are substantial changes to parking lots and access areas that are supporting these kinds of uses. So it allows the planning board to really look at it on an administrative basis. It's not a special permit process. There are very distinct things that the planning board looks at in terms of drainage of the site, the circulation of the site, whether the parking and setbacks meet the requirements of the zoning bylaw, whether the signage is in accordance with the zoning bylaw, and so forth. There's not a lot of discretion involved, but it does allow for other boards and other departments in the town to weigh in on these things. It also provides a pretty strict timeline for how fast the planning board has to review it, hold a meeting on it, make a decision, and go forward, and provides that there has to be compliance with any terms and conditions of the site plan review in order to obtain a building permit. So it's pretty a standard approach that most communities have. Some communities use a special permit process. I think the administrative process is a lot more straightforward and can be applied to more uses without too much trouble. There's no direct appeal to court. If someone is unhappy with it, essentially the process will eventually go to the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Okay, thank you, Judge Cutler. All right, if we can go down, well, I think an important thing there too is that not only is it applicable to commercial districts, but we will be making them applicable to multifamily developments. And to the extent that we have to at least zone for more of that because of that MBTA mandate, we'll be prepared to make sure there's a sufficient degree of scrutiny by the boards, by the planning board for those projects that do come forward. If we could scroll down a little further to the part 2 and 3. Next page, please. Sorry. Actually, it's quite a few pages down, I'm sorry. If you're looking at the comparisons as we scroll through these, again, there's a lot that is substantively the same, but we've just cleaned up, consolidated language, and gotten rid of excess verbiage anywhere we could, which was one of the things that the diagnostic had pointed out throughout our bylaw. This Article 12 has 3 parts to it, but also will be voted in just one vote. The second part of it is about the use variance provision. Anyone's a regular attendee at town meeting for decades, the town's bylaw allowed for someone to apply for a variance as to a use that would not be allowed in a given area. That was removed from our bylaw in the early 2000s by an amendment that was made at town meeting. There wasn't a lot of debate about it. A couple of town meetings ago, we brought back the use variance. We put it back in the existing section 304.2. It is better suited to be here. And in the way we have reworded the variance provision here in Article 12, we've incorporated that. So the 304.2 section can be deleted because now we are allowing the use variance here in Article 12. A couple of definition changes too, again, just to correct some statutory references for special permit variance, the Zoning Act. I think there's a next page to this. And adding definitions that weren't in our bylaw that should be there about site plan review and identifying who the special permit granting authority is. And in certain cases, that's the planning board, certain cases, it's the Zoning Board of Appeals. One of the things I'll note here is that we're coming up to the next article we're going to discuss is Article 2, our definitions. We are making changes in that article, but in connection with Article 12 and Article 6, we are also making some definitional changes in Article 2. We're just putting them together with Article 6 and 12 for the subject matter, the relation of the subject matter. But there be a number of changes to Article 2 in this go-round as set forth in all of these articles. All right, the next warrant article is about Article 2, and these are definition changes that are being proposed that are not tied to some of the other specific articles. The definition of board and the zoning bylaw are now addressed elsewhere, so they do not have to be in Article 2. The definition of premises, it's a simple housekeeping change because something was added on about Article 11 in the parentheses at the end of that definition for who knows what reason, but it doesn't belong there, so it's going to be just cleaned up. The one significant definition that we are proposing to change is the definition of height of a structure. And Clark, you want to bring up the two things because we'll need to bring them up here so both the audience can see them and then the Zoom people can see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yes, Katie, go ahead.
Hi, Katie Dugan, I just wanted to clarify, when you were referencing the definitional changes in Article 12 that were being added to the 2 minor ones about site plan.
Yeah.
Are those being, you're voting on them in Article 12, and yet the definitions are all being consolidated into Article 2?
The definitions that are being dealt with are in Article 2 today. Same with Article 6. 6, the signs, where we're making some definitional changes. So actually, there's changes to Article 2, the definitions themselves, in 3 separate warrant articles. But the ones related to signs, we grouped together with the sign warrant article. The ones with the administrative enforcement, which is Article 12, we grouped with that just to keep subject matters together.
Okay,
So actually, Article 2 will get amended 3 different times by this town meeting in 3 different warrant articles.
So bottom line, we are not repeating the past mistake of scattering definitions.
No.
We're consolidating them, but we'll have 3 separate votes.
Correct. Correct. We're dealing with the changes by subject matter, but yes, the intent is to move as many definitions as possible in one place. In the fall, a lot of the add-on articles from, let's say, 14 and above, 14 to 22, a lot of those new ones added their own little sets of definitions. It will probably be, when we get to those, moving those definitions into Article 2, perhaps deleting some of them as being unnecessary, but yeah, that is the intent, yes.
For Katie, one of the purposes of setting this up was to do exactly what you brought up. That's why we brought KP Law and Chief Justice Cutler involved to go over everything and consolidate it so we didn't have duplicate. Everything is there, consistent and they've done a very good job.
Could I have one question?
Yeah.
Can you give me an idea of what the deadline is for someone that wants to do something versus the advertising and the going to town meeting? And how does that happen? In other words, when will I have to get a permit request?
So you mean to beat these changes?
Yes. No, to protect whatever it is that I might have.
It was when the public
Well-
advertising went out, essentially. So
Okay,
it's
so that's,
for the meeting that's next week. The public advertising has happened already.
okay, so that means.
Straight language of, I think, 48, section 6.
Yeah, Judge Cutler, if you could help us out with that one.
Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty hearing.
So
I'm
the
sorry.
the question was, if somebody has rights under our existing bylaw and wants to do something under our existing bylaw, what's the time frame given these changes that are being proposed? Like when
They
we
would have had to have either obtained a building permit or a special permit before the change, or the subject property needs to be shown on a plan that gets endorsed by the planning board and recorded prior to the town meeting vote that makes it effective. But I just want to note that there are very, very few changes that are being proposed that would affect anything anybody already has or was contemplating. I think the Article 8 and the Article probably the Article 8 definition of height is about the only one that really makes a substantive change for people's properties.
Excuse me, Judge Cutler, this is Clark Brewer. It's too late for the change in the height. Because the height has been publicly advertised, it's gonna be on the warrant. The boards will be reviewing, the planning board will review and make a recommendation. Whether it passes on the floor of town meeting or not, if it does pass it on the floor of town meeting.
If it passes on the floor of town meeting, it becomes effective. Well, the effective date of the change is actually not until town meeting votes, but anything, you can't issue a building permit or obtain a building permit or special permit that violates that change in the interim between the time of the publication of the notice of the planning board public hearing and the actual effective date. So there's a kind of limbo period, but any permit that would be issued that wouldn't comply with the new requirement would be at risk if the requirement passes. If the requirement doesn't pass, then there's no harm, no foul.
Too late,
Too late for one particular
unless
thing.
it doesn't pass on the height.
So the height is the only thing that is going to matter today.
And
Yeah,
again,
we're-
this is going forward. This will mostly affect new buildings, but it may result in nonconformities of buildings that were measured under the previous definition.
We haven't done any analysis on how many buildings would become non-conforming with this height change, nor have we done any particular analysis on with examples in real time and space.
All right, you can bring that up in a moment. Let me actually explain what it is that's being proposed first, if I may. But Katie,
Katie Dugan, 100 Black Rock Road. Actually, some analysis has been done relative to height. The previous iteration of this group actually looked at height measurements for large home review dating back to 2007. And we found no examples in that large home review where the maximum height was actually being utilized by applicants. So we looked at that. We also looked at ZBA hearings relative to height, and again, didn't find people butting up against height. So in terms of total analysis, there's no way to do it by parcel because it's not recorded in the assessor's data. You just have to look at the new construction that was happening. We looked at 2017 and beyond, and didn't find evidence that height, in terms of use of maximum height, was an issue that was being bumped into in terms of at least residential construction.
Well, in terms of this committee, we haven't done an analysis, or we don't have the analysis together for the planning board public hearing.
Well-
But if that is somewhere we could have.
Yeah,
that would be great.
again, we're going to debate this in a moment. I'm not trying to cut off debate, but the research work of the bylaw working group is freely available to us and has been since day one, and we do have some data. Let me first explain what it is that's being proposed. If everyone could look at the definition on the right. Essentially, the change is this. Height is measured, obviously, from bottom to top. We have a uniform height requirement under the table of dimensional regulations at the moment of 35 feet. That applies to every district in town. We are not messing with that number. If we do anything to that number, that would be a change when we just deal with the table in the fall town meeting. Right now, we're just proposing to change the definition of how you measure that 35 feet and from what points. We are not proposing change to the 35 feet. I want to emphasize that. All right, so at the bottom measurement, we do not have ideally flat ground everywhere in town. We have undulating terrain everywhere. Traditionally, we have been getting a measurement of what is the mean grade from 2 points, maybe 3, maybe 4. What we are proposing for the measurement from the bottom is, I'm trying to look for it there, but it might be in the next page, but we are increasing the number of data points to 12, equidistant around the perimeter of the building. Our existing definition says you measure that 10 feet from where the building is going to be. We still keep that. But what we will have is more data points at the bottom from which to get a mean grade, which will be the starting point of the 35-foot calculation. I will tell you that the zoning bylaw committee voted 5-0 in favor of that part of this. The second part of this is where we measure the top. And our current bylaw says the top is the top, the height, the highest point, except with respect to a sloped roof, we have a measure to the midpoint of the slope, and then a limitation that you can go 5 feet above that. So at the ridge of a sloped roof, you could be 40 feet high. Okay. Whether it's mostly driven by common sense. There are a number of us, myself included, who have for years said that is just illogical, it makes no sense. And what the proposed change is to make every type of roof measured to its highest point. So 35 feet would be flat top of the flat roof, flat part of the mansard roof, highest point of the gambrel roof, And on a peaked roof, it would be to the peak. And that is what we are proposing here to do. There is still an additional add-on that can be done for rooftop equipment that can go above that. Now, as Katie pointed out, we do not have a lot of examples where people are pushing that limit that is dictating a change from that perspective, or actually even dictating a change of 35 feet when we get to that discussion in the fall. We did have a project in the planning board a couple of years ago that brought this issue into focus because they were at the limit. We only had 2 measurement points, I believe, at the bottom. And, you know, there were a number of questions of what the height really was. Were they over 35 feet? Were they just under, as they claimed? So one of the things we do want to do is just set a definition following common sense of what the top point should be. That top means top, highest point, whatever kind of roof it's going to be. I'm going to point out on the slide down at the bottom some of the issues that we are facing here, so that the building heights, you know, with the kind of development we're facing in residential and certainly in commercial that we've seen recently, people are pushing the 35-foot limit, although that is a fairly recent phenomenon. Katie is correct. Data from large review of our large home review applications does not support that many people are pushing the 35-foot limit. We don't think there's been sufficient data points from the bottom, so that's why we're adding them. The measurement to the middle of a slope roof is just being addressed here on pure illogic of it. And then we will have a clarification of what the height is, the top height is on all buildings, no matter what the roof style is. The majority of view of this on the committee, so the committee voted 3-2 on this part of it. We were 5-0 on changing the bottom measurement language. We were 3-2 in favor of changing this top measurement language. And the majority view is it's common sense, and it avoids the possibility of having 40-foot high structures around town. I will tell you as a member of the planning board that with large home reviews, we do get some objections to it. We certainly on 143 and public hearings have gotten objections to the height of some buildings being built in the village. They're all in compliance. And I would suggest that that is where we would address, is 35 feet the right number, rather than the definition of what the top point should be. Logic says the top should be the top, in my view, in the view of the majority. The 35 feet is something we can address. There's been a suggestion maybe we make it higher in commercial districts than in residential districts. Our data showed us that 35 feet is maybe on the high end of the range, but the range in a typical suburban town is 30 to 35 feet. 32 is common. You know, we're not out of whack there. We are in the range of acceptable with our 35 feet. But yes.
Do you want to take questions from Zoom as well?
Yes, in a
Okay.
second. Let me
Okay.
just finish the point. So, and then, so that, you know, that's our thinking there, is that, you know, we want to avoid having too high structures in town if the patterns in development, the pressures of prices and building big is driving us closer to houses that are going to be, houses and commercial structures that are going to be closer to 40 feet than 35 feet. Yes, I'll take a question and then I'll get to what the other point of view is.
Okay, we'll take a question from Zoom. Jack Buckley, how does this height change impact buildings that need to be raised to accommodate for sea level rise and storm surge?
This is when I wish the building inspector was here. That's a good question, Jack. Let us take a look at that. I don't know that anybody has ever had to shorten their building because they're raising it. And I don't think that that would ever be ordered. I think there would be grandfathering that might come into play in that scenario. But
For the village harbor village overlay district, we did set the grade plane as the floodplain. actually, it happened to be the same as the average grade.
Mhm.
So it wasn't really any bonus to the developer at that location. But if the same rule were applied elsewhere, where the floodplain was higher than the actual grade, that would be a height bonus.
Right. Well, again, Jack's question, if I understand it correctly, is about an existing house that has to go up. Yes, in the harbor, we have to account for what's called base flood elevation before we have a bottom starting point. And in the harbor today, it is base flood elevation, then 35 feet, you start measuring from that. And that's why we're gonna have a tall building down in the harbor. The harbor and new construction where there are floodplains, that's a place where we might want to say, we should depart from 35 feet because we also have to account for this base flood elevation. But for an existing structure that Jack's asking about, that creates a dilemma because you're not going to tell somebody to knock off their existing attic just because they have to go up. And I think as we do the bylaw in the future, in the fall, and the dimensional regulations, I think we need to account for that. I think it's a very good point.
There might be a provision for an exception to the height rule, and being in a floodplain could be a reasonable location for that. For example, Milton has a height variance. It's a 35-foot height in Milton, but they allow it's not a variance, but it's to exceed for reasonable reasons.
Yeah.
But it's a special permit with the.
I'm sure
ZBA.
Situate must have something like it from Peggy, for things that were raised on Peggy. And the other thing is, we do have the general variance provision, and while the application of it is very narrow under state law, it's about the uniqueness of the topography and the geography. I think if a property is being compelled because of floodwaters, it might actually fall under the room. I'm not going to make any legal opinions here or tie the zoning board's hands on that, but you could foresee that possibly that makes an argument for actual allowance of the variance. But it's an excellent question, Jack, and we will need to address that as we look at the actual height limits that we set in different areas of the town, and as we deal with a climate change and climate resiliency bylaw. All right. All right.
Can I address this?
Sure.
Steve, New York. If this passes,
Non-resident.
non-resident, absolutely non-resident, a property owner in Cohasset.
I think that should be pointed
If
out.
this passes at this town meeting, and you come back in the fall with your change in the height, and that doesn't pass, how does somebody like Wayne calculate the height of his building? Does he use the definition?
Well, he'll use the definition, and if the new numbers don't change, it'll still be 35 feet.
But it's measured differently. So
Yeah.
you have changed the height.
We've only changed it with respect to, this change would only change it with respect to a peaked roof, because you're no longer measuring to a midpoint, you're measuring to the high point. Okay.
But you're taking more of a base around the building, by taking 12 points around the building. Okay.
Well, as far as the bottom goes, we're looking for coming up to something closer to a true mean than just two arbitrary points that happen to suit a builder and developer to maximize the height.
So it does change potentially.
Changes practices, it does change his
In fact,
practices.
but the issue from a practical standpoint, if I'm a developer, I'm going to put a building up, and my peak on my roof is going to be the same as a flat roof, I'm going to do all flat roofs, because I'm going to get a lot.
Well, before everybody got here, we were kicking that idea around. I don't think it's going to encourage that. And again, as Katie points out, we have data that people aren't, in practice, haven't been pushing the limit too much. There have been a few isolated projects here and there that are pushing the limit on the 35 feet. There is an ongoing project that's under ongoing permitting, and I don't want to talk too much about that, originally proposed a flat roof. And now they're proposing a mansard roof, which to me is just a variation of a flat roof. And, but in defense of that project, it's got a unique situation of what's underneath the property, that it had to build up a little higher and had to go flat.
The only thing I would caution, though, is with the new change with all these multifamilies that are going to be driven on Cohasset by the T.
Yep.
Okay, you're going to see more pressure from developers to get as many units as they can in those buildings. So be
Yes.
careful what you ask for.
Measure that height. But believe me, we all understand that, but again, I'll say this, I might not be able to say it at town meeting, but we're doing this for the people of Cohasset, not for developers. But I perfectly understand what's coming because, again, we've already seen a recent example in the village, but we also have seen a year ago, a village project, bigger building that's there today, it's another story, but peaked, colonial looking. It depends on the site, depends on what they want to try to get out of it, depends what, the current project being proposed has another challenge to it because the stream runs under it. So it has another challenge about getting height, so it can actually have a usable building. We can't account for people's tastes. I doubt we'll see a rash of,
Excuse me, Tom.
single family.
I made the diagram.
No, I know, I'm gonna get to it in a second.
On the right-hand side.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that in a
It
second.
does make the right point. There's a volumetric advantage
All right,
that's created for flat roofs with this change. And it's only 5 feet for lowering the 40 feet to the 35 for a main house, and it's 5 feet lowering for the 1.5-story garage or portion of a building that can be closer to the property line that defined as 15 feet. So you're effectively making a 1.5-story option that's available now, 1 story, but you're giving a volumetric advantage to the flat roof.
I'm gonna get it out of here.
You just pull it out. There you go.
All right. Let me move.
Except for the wire.
Yeah, I know, I don't want to trip on this. Let me move if I may, and I hope people on the screen can see what I'm doing. You can put these up on the,
I'm gonna stick it out.
so Zoom people can see it. All right, we have 2 sketches here that kind of show what we're doing. This sketch was done by the working group about 1.5 years ago. It is actually a variation of, I believe, the picture that's shown in the Hingham bylaw to define height. And I'm just going to point out this one is showing the different grades. And one of the other changes that goes with this bylaw is putting in a definition of grade, both pre-construction and finished, so that we understand that we're operating from pre-construction grade. So somebody can't cheat this definition or cheat the 35 feet by bringing in a lot of fill and then building on top of it. So everything will be measured from pre-construction grade. The bylaw, this is another one of those bylaws that will include some other definitions that are being added to Article 2. Over here, Clark Brewer, who is our resident architect, brought this to show the difference with the impact. And again, the main change here is the impact on the definition of height for pitched roof, where today it's at the midpoint. We allow for 5 feet, and the ridge can be up here at 40 feet as a maximum. And it's changed if we have 35 feet and we're now measuring at the peak, obviously we have a lower profile and a lower structure. And again, it's looking overall, the intent here overall is to not allow for the possibility, particularly in our residential areas, of 40-foot high structures. And, the sentiment that I hear when I'm on the planning board at a large home review, that people don't want that. So again, whether we need to play with the 35 feet, whether we allow 40 feet in the village, in the harbor, commercial areas on 3A, for the multifamilies that may come on 3A, we can decide that in the fall by doing some variation. In the harbor, we've already talked about at the previous forum, and we've talked about in the past, at least on the working group, of changing the height in the harbor because of the base flood elevation. So it might not be 35 feet anymore, it'll be something lower, because we have to account for that floodplain that's there.
Tom, may I make a brief comment?
Yeah, so these are illustrating, exactly what we're facing here with this proposed change. Go ahead, Jim.
One of the purposes of having these hearings, hear from people, to hear comments, because nothing is cast in stone at this point.
Right.
So when people have comments, now you bring in the public, it becomes part of the public dialogue. Change things. We can change it or modify it or decide to keep it the same without having the unwieldy process of being an all or nothing thing at the town meeting. So if you have comments, right? You can not only give them tonight, but you can send them to Tom or or this committee, so all of us can look at it. And I would encourage everybody here and people at home to do so.
Right. Thank you, Jack. That's very important. And again, next week too, March 8th, 6:30, not 7 o'clock, 6:30, same place. The planning board will be doing its hearings, and that'll be the first committee that is charged with giving some formal recommendations, yea or nay on these. Yeah, Wayne, go ahead.
Following that, on a flat roof, I just want to know, is non-habitable space, meaning like a mansard roof where you go down and you sort of hide the top of that roof and make it look nicer, like the Red Lion Inn, for instance?
Well, that's being proposed. It's being proposed right now in the village.
That to me it's decoration. So decoration, not, not limiting by the height.
Well, it's good that you bring that up because you agree with me. The proposal right now before us was proposing a mansard roof. And the argument was, well, this is a sloped roof, so let us measure the 35 feet to the midpoint of, I don't know what you call it. Do you call it a mansard? And I disagree with that. I was outvoted on the planning board on that. So that we're going to have a building that is, in my view, a foot or two too tall, but
The most important thing is you
acceptable.
have your air conditioners up there and stuff.
Yeah,
And it's safe for someone to go up to be able to repair them.
Right.
And to look at the roof.
And that part of the,
Other uses.
right, well, that part of the definition is not changing. There still will be the allowance for equipment on top of it. We're
But you
just,
won't be able to hide it if you're at 35 feet.
no, I believe that, we can go back to the definition, but I believe the definition allows for that. And the project that we are looking at, and again, I don't want to get, I'm not saying anything of substance on the decision, but the project that's before us is proposing a mansard roof with equipment on the top that we have asked to be shielded, and it will be shielded. Now, the top of that shielding and that equipment is certainly going to be 40 feet or very close to it. That's allowable. It's allowable under the current bylaw, and it is allowable under the
So it
proposed.
won't change.
No, the top part that changes, I mean, because you can have flat roofs, you can have mansard roofs now. We have 35 feet with a flat roof, and we're not seeing a lot of flat roofs. We just don't see them, probably for aesthetic reasons. But the main change here with the top is the peaked roof. And we're talking, to be sure, residential, although we have a peaked roof, new project in the village, is the peak roof, instead of measuring it at the midpoint, it'll be measured at the top of the peak. And what is that going to do? In Clark's illustration, it's going to make for a smaller attic. But if you take that a story is, let's say, 10 feet, 35 feet is still a 3.5-story building, and that's a big house. I don't think we're really taking anything away from what the trend is here, other than,
It doesn't actually work that way with commercial, because commercial floor-to-floor heights are 13 or 16 feet. It's just the way it's gotta be. So this change does affect commercial districts, and it really will limit those to 2 stories. So effectively.
which is what we've
the
had.
Change is from a 2.5-story to a 2-story in the main 35-foot height, and for the 15-foot height, it goes from a 1.5-story to essentially a 1-story is what the height will allow.
And as,
Both of those types being lowered by 5 feet.
and personally, and I think the focus of the working group prior and to this committee has been on the residential districts. However, this is uniform all over town. And as we discussed in the committee, when we get to the fall and we're looking at the table of dimensions, and we need to make accommodation for commercial districts if we want taller commercial buildings, we can. But the town of Cohasset has had this 35-foot height limit in commercial districts ever since it had the bylaw, or at least since '86, if not earlier. And I don't see that we have ever been under pressure to build a 3 or 4-story commercial building in town. Now, with the multifamily housing thing that we may be having shoved down our throats, we may have to revisit that, and we will revisit that when we deal with the 35 number. This definition we just suggest you just makes sense. But David, I didn't.
David Farad, member of the zoning. What we're trying to do, I think the immediate concern was with residential, and it is to keep from gaming from the system. Because currently with the 2 points to create the mean, we go to the multiple points, which will help. And what has been created through the years is basically a legal fiction. So if you go down to town hall, you go look at the plans, it says it's 35 feet because it's from where it's measured. But in actuality, the top of that house is not 35 feet from the highest point. It can be 40, it can be above that, because they're picking the 2 best areas to measure from to get the most volume in the house. So this makes 35 feet again when it comes to residential. When it comes to commercial buildings, when most of the commercial buildings in town, they're not built on the grades that the residential is when you're built on a hill or something. There are some areas of 3A where they're up on the hill, but generally the grades have been flattened out, so they're measuring from all the same space. So the 35 feet isn't a problem because the grade is still the same. But the real issue is with residential, because the 35 feet is not 35 feet, and it's been that way for a long time. It's been gamed, the system has been gamed for a long time. So getting the multiple points and doing it to the top will keep it within that 35-foot range. And again, for commercial, I think it's a whole different story. There's also other things with commercial. Again, if you have a flat roof and you have your air conditioning, things like that have to go on the top of the roof, they're allowed to go up to 40 feet for that. So there's other little places where for commercial that they can get some more there, because there are differences between commercial and residential construction, because you have, fire systems, air conditioning, heating, the systems are different for commercial.
Yes, thank you, David. All right, I don't see that we have any other questions on Zoom, and certainly internally, we've had debate about this again. Changing the bottom measurement was 5.0, changing the top measurement was 3.2. I've heard from Steve and from Wayne, and we had some valuable input. And again, we are doing this early so that we have the time and the luxury to make some changes and come to town meeting with hopefully a consensus and perfect bylaw, or as perfect as one could be. So without further ado, we'll move on to the last article to consider tonight that has a significant change in it. This is Article 8 of the zoning bylaw, which deals with non-conforming lots and structures. Unlike the other articles that have multiple parts, this is going to be voted in 2 separate parts. One will be a complete reform of Article 8, which is mostly housekeeping, consolidation, and keeping our unique single lot exemption provision as is. The second change will be, though, to change our single lot exemption provision only. So, as I said, one part, the whole article as pretty much as is. Second part, making a change, and we're going to describe that change in a little bit. First, though, with Article 8, this is a very unique part of the bylaw. What do we mean by nonconformity? And so that means any aspect of a lot, a structure, or a use that is not conforming with the current dimensional use or use requirements of the bylaw. Uses and dimensions can change. You may have been conforming when it was built, conforming if the structure existed before 1955, before we had zoning. You may have been conforming at different times when we've made changes to zoning over the years. But if you are non-conforming now, you will come, your use is protected, you're grandfathered, but you will come under the auspices of Article 8. So what Article 8 does, it says uses that are in existence and structures that are built and lots developed prior to a zoning change that made them non-conforming are grandfathered. I forgot what the new term is, but grandfathered is now politically incorrect, I'm told. But they're regulated by Article 8 if you propose to expand or reconstruct the structure on that property. Okay, so you have a non-conforming lot, you have a non-conforming house, no changes, you continue to use it, you sell it normally, and it continues to be used as a grandfathered use. You want to change it by expanding, adding on to it, or reconstruct it if it has been destroyed in a fire, you have to go through the Article 8 process. Most of Article 8 is dealt with by special permit. Most of it is dealt by the Zoning Board of Appeals. Only if a project that is not, property is non-conforming in the village will be dealt with by the planning board. So I noticed that Woody Chidick, our chairman, is here, and he'll interject, I hope, when necessary, but this is mostly his board's bailiwick. What is the standard for approval? Well, you're not supposed to increase the nonconformity. So it first depends on what your nonconformity is, but if you're going to add to a piece of property, you're not supposed to make that nonconformity worse. And then the usual special permit standard is applied to it, which means a project is not substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood. So this is the first part of it. This is looking at the whole of Article 8, reforming it. It's mostly housekeeping changes. The substance is not substantially different here. We could scroll down. Provisions are being moved around. Provisions that legally are not necessary to have anymore are being taken out. And then the single lot exemption that we have is going to stay as it is, except if Judge Cutler, correct me if I'm wrong, we are bringing back that clarifying that this applies to residential lots.
Yes.
So, and
That's
that's some quirk that the judge caught the other day is that when we passed the state law that governs nonconformity, which is Chapter 48, Section 6, specifically refers that it applies to lots that are zoned for 1 or 2 family use. Our bylaw is originally written in 1955, did something similar and restricted it to lots in residence A and B, which were our only residential districts at the time. In 78, when we rewrote the bylaw in keeping with the change in the state law, the passage of 40A, we changed that, and it's just ambiguous that whether it applies simply to residential lots. I have never, as a lawyer, as a board member in this town for a long time, I don't know if Woody has ever seen, I don't think we've ever seen the single lot exemption applied in a commercial context. So I don't think anybody understands it, that use, but we're going back, just for clarification, we are going back to making sure that it only applies in residential context. So that is the only substantive change to the existing one. But part 1 is housekeeping, keep our single lot exemption the way it is. All right, let's get to part 2.
Can you go back to the beginning of that before you get too far?
Yeah, go ahead. Go back. Where do you want to stop?
Keep going up. This refers to, I don't know if we're got far enough there, expansion and reconstruction. Is that the 2 terms that you used?
Where you-
Right here, okay. Uses in existence. Grandfather regulated?
Oh, that's just, that's not the text of the bus.
Yeah, that's not the section.
All right, next.
It talked about, oh, yeah, it did, right there. It said expansion or reconstruction.
Yeah.
I think you want to add the word alteration in there because somebody can take a non-conforming structure and alter it without expanding it, and that's still required to go to the zoning board of appeals.
Is that true today?
Where is this?
I guess in the,
It says may continue without expansion or.
no, not that. That's not the text itself. Well, we'll look for that. No, I know what you're saying, and we'll look for that. I think wherever in the Judge Cutler, what he's saying is that wherever in this bylaw where it says it's applying to expansion and reconstruction, we should just add the word alteration as well. I suppose someone,
Zoning Board of Appeals would be required to
Excuse me,
make-
that was that's the existing bylaw provision?
I don't know, it just popped up on the screen and I saw it. did
Right,
not-
but that's also in the existing bylaw. There's no change made in that. It continues as long as it's not expanded or changed, it's lawful. It just
Well-
basically stays the same. An alteration would be a change or expansion. But the language is not changed from what is in the existing bylaw.
It was
All
a
right.
different paragraph.
all right, and I'm just making a note of it because, you know, the bylaw committee is meeting next Monday to do the follow-up of tonight, and we'll take a look at that. I understand what you're saying, but, all right. All right, if we could go now to the part two part. All right. Judge Cutler, you will jump in and help me whenever I mess this up. Let me explain the single lot exemption, which is a topic that comes under Article 8 with non-conforming. So state law, Chapter 40A, Section 6 is a section that deals with non-conforming lots. And it says, with respect to lots for single or two-family residential use lawfully in existence prior to a zoning change to the frontage, lot width, or setback, and not in common ownership with its neighbor at the time of the change, that lot is perpetually grandfathered from the zoning change that was made, and thus could be developed. So in its wisdom, when creating Section 40A in 1975, the state created this single instance of perpetual grandfathering, that if a lot pre-existed this zoning change, not in common ownership, and that's very important. Common ownership triggers what is called the merger doctrine, and a lot, once it is merged by the common ownership, they do not get the benefit of this exemption. They do not get the benefit of that grandfathering. However, the state went on in the next paragraph of 48, Section 6, yes, stay on the bottom there, to create an exception to that, that if you do have that common ownership problem, there are still certain circumstances when you could develop a lot, but you have to act fast. You have to have acted, if the lot was created prior to January 176, within 5 years of January 176, or within 5 years of the change itself. So that was the state law, and it gives you this one exception. Otherwise, if you have the common ownership in your lot history, the merger doctrine applies and you won't get the benefit of the single lot exemption. It's a very simplistic explanation. It's a very difficult legal concept for everybody, including judges, I think. Sometimes. And so let's go to the next page. And what did Cohasset do to that? So Cohasset changed the exception and did something different. And Cohasset basically said that if you have that common ownership problem, what a court said as late as 2017, 18 was that last decision on Atlantic? Basically, Cohasset has eliminated the merger doctrine. We essentially are not concerned about common ownership problems. And we don't have a time limit like the state exception does as to when you need to act to take advantage of your ability to build. The result, but what Cohasset did to soften that blow of not having the same restrictions that the state law did is we required larger minimum lot sizes to be able to build. The state would only require a 5,000 square foot lot. We have varying minimum lot sizes, which are smaller than what's required in those districts, but larger than what the state law would allow. So what does that mean? So the most recent example of this was 2017-18, where there was a court case, and a lot that would not have qualified for development under the state single lot exemption was able to be built upon because Cohasset's was sort of open-ended in application. Now, how many lots have the benefit of this? So we don't know. We had guessed 76 at one point, a year and a half ago, when the bylaw working group was considering this. But unless you do an actual lot by lot comparison and analysis of each lot's ownership history, you really can't tell. It's somewhere 76 to maybe a couple of hundred that might have this next. So this has been considered an issue by many that Cohasset basically has these open-ended grandfathering rights that wouldn't occur under state law. And we talked about for the fall 21 town meeting, actually repealing this provision. And then I will give credit, Mr. Bjorklund brought this to our attention. There was a case in the Supreme Judicial Court, and maybe you remember the name, but none of us can remember the name quickly.
I had one of the cases.
It's something with something, yeah. So there was a time when Orleans had a bylaw like ours that granted additional and added grandfathering rights than the state law. They repealed it. And the lot that eventually became an issue in this case was developable under that Orleans bylaw the year before it was repealed. The SJC decision was 30 years later in 2000 and said that when a town like Orleans or Cohasset had granted extra grandfathering rights at some point in time, and those rights would have allowed somebody to build prior to the repeal or amendment of those rights fall back into the basic premise and the basic grandfathering of 40A Section 6. The long and the short of that is if you have rights under the Cohasset's unique bylaw provision today, you will have rights in the future, no matter what we do here at this town meeting, whether we were to repeal this or amend it as we're proposing. So that, I think it's a very important point that no one's rights will be, who have rights today will be adversely impacted. But again, we do not know who has those rights without analyzing everyone's property individually. I'll give an example that when we did have Mr. Bjorklund and some property owners come to the working group meetings back in the fall of 21, one owner thought he would be adversely impacted. When you actually looked at his lot situation, he would not. He would not have fallen under the Cohasset exception, the Cohasset rule. He would have fallen under the state law and his rights to develop. He had a house straddling two lots, so he had a common ownership problem. He would not have been able to develop those two lots separately. So whatever we did wouldn't affect him, won't affect him today. He does not have rights under the Cohasset exception, mostly because of the size of his lots. So if you have rights, nothing changes. If you don't have rights, nothing changes. What we are trying to do here, rather than repeal it, is to create a cutoff date. To create a cutoff date to cut off creation of new grandfathering rights in the future going forward. If I hadn't made the point, Orleans had a bylaw like this once, repealed it. We are unique. Our version in section 8.3 of our bylaw today, our exception to the state law, is unique. We haven't found anything else in the state like it. So we are a true outlier, and we are trying to, one part of this amendment is to bring us back into the rest of the Commonwealth. So what we're proposing to do here, and this will be separately voted on as just an amendment to the single lot exemption provision, is to put in a cutoff date. In other words, you would have to have plans of record as of June 30, 2023, which is the end of the fiscal year. Okay. You can see there before the question comes up about the interim gray period. If you have a new subdivision plan created prior to 6/23 but not approved until after 6/30/23, you have until 8 years from endorsement to build. Okay, so there is a transition that's built into that by state law. Our research in just the last few days showed us that when the original version of this bylaw in 1955 did have a date cutoff. It did say that all the lots that might be able to benefit from this would have to have been of record as of X date in 1955 when the bylaw was passed. In 1978, for whatever reason, as we reformed the bylaw to comply with the new state law, that disappeared to our current version. And we're proposing then in principle to go back to what we originally had in 1955, which was some cutoff date for it. Had we kept that 1955 bylaw, there's a lot of lots in town that have been developed under our unique exception that never would have been developed. So we are looking to say lots would have to be of record before the end of this fiscal year. That would be the change. And what that would do is not allow our open-ended, unique exception to the single lot exemption provision to new rights to be created in that going forward from June 30th.
Makes sense to me. Seems like any new lots should conform to the zoning requirements.
Right. I mean, the town speaks through its, that town meeting that it wants to be developed a certain way and zoned a certain way. And yes, the state does create a very narrow exception for perpetual grandfathering, but the state cuts it off at some point. We never cut it off, or we had it cut off at one point and we switched to in another direction. Judge Cutler, I don't know if there's anything you can add to that from your perspective on it. I know it was a very simplistic
No, I think that was fine. I think the only thing I would add is that with respect to the cutoff date, this just simply doesn't allow new lots to get the benefit of this. And I think that's an important emphasis. If no cutoff date is put in, the existing single lot exemption will apply to every new lot that's created going forward. And so, you're basically saying as long as you meet current day's requirements, you never have to worry about changes in zoning. Now, that's a policy matter for the town to decide, but if this is not something that the town wants to continue with, the best way to deal with it, and really from what I can figure out, the only real way to deal with it is to put a cutoff date in. You can't repeal it entirely, because if you were, it wouldn't have any meaning. Those lots that were already protected are already protected, and the fact that the language isn't in the bylaw anymore doesn't save the day for the town. The other thing that I might want to mention is if this will no longer apply to new lots, those new lots will still have the benefit of the protection for single lot exceptions that's in the statute. It's just that they can't be protected if they're held in common ownership after a certain period, after the initial 5 years. So there's still protection. The new lots will not be left without any protections.
Thank you. And I want to emphasize to everyone out there who might be listening to this, if you have an empty lot in town that doesn't conform with the current zoning, for example, the area, if you have no common ownership with the lots around you, and by the way, the state courts have dealt with people who get cute about common ownership, putting something in a trust, something in their own name, and they see through all of that stuff. So there's no cute way around that. But if you do not have a common ownership problem, as long as you meet the minimum lot size in Chapter 48, Section 6, you'll have perpetual grandfathering. If you have rights under our unique Cohasset bylaw, and that requires also meeting our minimum lot standard, which is higher than the state's, you will still have those rights because of that Supreme Judicial Court decision, even if we amend this. It's just that going forward, as we have new lots developed, new subdivisions, new Form As, whatever, those new lots are not going to get the benefit of this open-ended exception and perpetual grandfathering. And again, it brings back the town having some control over its destiny and making sure that properties go forward, comply with the zoning that we in our wisdom have decided to pass at that time. Yes, Steve?
Unless you put them into a separate ownership. And then they'll be protected forever. The only ones that will lose are ones that people that don't put the extra lot in a different name. So a husband and wife can own the house, and either a husband or wife alone can own the lot, and they'll be protected.
I thought that case law had gotten around that cute trick, but
Not that one. Trust,
A-
yes.
Actually, it's a fact-based question that the courts deal with depending upon the overall facts. And the question is whether they're in concert to do this as a united couple who have this ownership or not. And it's determined by the courts.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions about this one?
And on Zoom.
It was a year and a half ago, somewhat controversial. We had people show up at the meeting and
This is a lot different.
Mr. Bjorklund, well, so from you, I will appreciate the comment. And,
Tom,
yes,
we do have one question on
yes,
Zoom.
go ahead.
Hello, do you still plan to try and change the language for road access to these grandfathered lots at the fall meeting? I'm referring to the changes that were declined last year at town meeting. The access road met the standards when it was created. Gentleman's name is Mike, but he doesn't have a last name.
Okay. Well, in the fall 21 town meeting, we tried to make a simple change to the definition of street and way. At the same time, the planning board was considering passage of regulations that would regulate roadways that were not common driveways, but also not created under the subdivision control law, of which there are many in town, the gray area between those two regulatory points. That was modeled on a Plymouth bylaw. I will say, what happened there, that simple definitional change was conflated with the proposed regulation change, not even a bylaw change. There's been no decision on what we're going to do with that. But if we are going to deal with the issue of access to lots, and again, what's missing in our regulatory framework is we regulate how subdivision roads should be built, and we regulate common driveways. There's been proposals to change the common driveway just to make it apply to less lots, but also to regulate the construction of the roadways that are between subdivision and common driveway. If we deal with that at all, and no decision has been made on that, it would be dealt with in the fall. It had been talked about as a regulation of the planning board. I was a proponent of that. I'm more of the thinking it should be dealt with as bylaw before town meeting rather than as regulation. We had a model from Plymouth that does it, that regulates these three types of access. Again, no decisions have been made on that, but you'll certainly get enough notice and publicity, and it'll probably be the subject of a forum so that we can have some feedback like this, because it is somewhat of a controversial topic, or had proven to be in the past. Anything else? No? Oh, sorry, yes.
Michael Baker, Star Materials. I guess if everyone's rights are grandfathered in and this doesn't change anything for anyone with existing rights, what is kind of being addressed here?
Well, not everyone is grandfathered in. Again, it's impossible to tell how many people have rights under our existing bylaw. In the working group, we took a stab at that by throwing out the number 76, but that was based on an analysis of the assessor's codes in the assessor's office, which are a slightly different animal than how properties are described at the registry of deeds or under zoning. And it's not an apples to apples comparison. So then I believe there was talk, it might have been not 76, maybe it was 200, but it's not like every lot in town has the benefit of these perpetual grandfathering rights. And you just have to, the only way to examine them, unless we, what do we have, 3,200 parcels in town? Unless we examine the history of each one, the recorded history at the registry of deeds at each one, we can't know. And as I say, there was an example of a gentleman who came there and thought because he had a house straddling two 10,000 square foot lots that he had rights under our existing bylaw. Well, examination proves that he did not. And so it takes that kind of case-by-case analysis. It's just important to know that if we do not have some kind of cutoff or repeal, and we're not proposing repeal, but we're this date cutoff, these rights can keep going. And we will create new grandfathering rights. The lot that was allowed by the courts, well, first allowed by the zoning board, but challenged by abutters, and the court basically said the zoning board had to do this because our bylaw, has just eliminated the merger doctrine. That lot wouldn't have been developed had we not had this provision. If we had our 1955 provision, unless that lot was created before 1955, it would never have had grandfathering rights. So the question is, do we want marginal lots that are no longer in compliance with our zoning to be developed? Why do we have zoning? Why do we have minimum area requirements and setback requirements if they're not going to mean something? And that's what we're trying to do, is get back control of that, at least going forward. We can't undo what Cohasset has done because the SJC told us we can't undo what we have done, as they told Orleans back in 2000. So that's the reason to do it. But again, we don't know how many we're cutting off. We don't know how many still have the rights who aren't going to be affected by this at all. And we can't unless we did a property by property study.
We have one more
Well,
question.
I don't know if the gentleman looked like he might have a follow-up, but
Tom,
I'm trying to understand. Citing, that's what I don't.
well, we're trying to fight what would he jump into since your board deals with it, but we're trying to fight that the ability of undersized lots that are no longer in compliance with our zoning to be developed. Because we have made a statement at our town that we want certain lot parameters and dimensions, and we need to stick to that.
Really, just to understand the impact of this, if you go to Windy Hill, there is a non-conforming lot, or a conforming lot under the residential regulations today that is split into two non-conforming, so that instead of under today's development rules, it would have been two houses that were put on that lot because it had the ability in perpetuity to access under single lot exemption, the older regulation sizes for B, two houses were put up. So if you're driving down to Jerusalem and you're looking at Street Pond, you get Windy Hill, there are two very large homes that sit on that lot where one would have been constructed if single lot exemption didn't exist. And what we're saying is that going forward, if there is a new lot that is created, you don't have that ability to subdivide. For the existing house that already have it, their grandfather is in perpetuity under this law versus law. And going forward, for new lots, I personally feel that we have a reason that we chose to have a residential B lot as it is, and not have such small lots popping up in a residence where the larger lots are the predominant size. That's the visual that happens in town.
Couldn't explain it better. You're talking your way back onto this committee, by the way. But Clark, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, one point I think we should all keep in mind, I think there was a recent court decision, either Bylaw or Comstock, that as a post note said that the term grandfathering and should not be used anymore, that the terms would be existing non-conforming or something like that, because apparently grandfathering is a racist term from the South.
Yeah, I made a little joke
So we
before
should
that
take it out.
I believe that it popped into my head. I believe the term now is preserved as opposed to grandfathered.
Whatever you want to use that makes sense. Existing non-conforming, I think, works, but grandfathering as a term is out.
Yes. Thank you. Judge Cutler, is there anything you'd want to add to answer?
Oh,
the
I would just say,
gentleman's
just
question?
as a point of order, I don't believe we use grandfathering in any of the new proposed language of the bylaw. I don't think we use that term.
But probably not in the language, the actual language changes that you put together, but in some of the descriptions, it's still a term that's in writing here.
Good point.
Just wanted,
For our next hearings.
yes. Judge Cutler, is there anything else you wanted to add to answering the gentleman here that?
I think if I understood the question was why put the cutoff date now if we don't know how many lots are already have the benefit? Was that I wasn't clear on the question.
Is that the gist of your question, sir?
I was just trying to understand the purpose if everyone's grandfathered.
What is the purpose?
Yeah.
And the purpose is to not have any more lots be permitted under this exception. Right now, potentially, every vacant lot of record in the town, and I don't know how many that is, can take advantage of this exception if the town were to, in the future, increase dimensional requirements beyond what they have now. So this will not, by putting in a cutoff date, you won't have that open-ended forever and ever, constantly adding to the number of lots in the town that may be protected with this special protection. They still, again, still protected from increases in dimensional requirements for single and two-family lots, as long as they meet the requirements that were in effect when the new provisions come in, and as long as they have at least 5,000 square feet and at least 50 feet of frontage. I note that under the special exception, there is no frontage requirement. So a lot could essentially be a back lot with no frontage of any kind and still be protected. So that's something to keep in mind. So this would not allow that situation in the future.
Okay, thank you, John.
So Mike had I guess he had a follow-up.
Okay.
He posed a question and he posed another question. So many of these lots, the word lots, are on private roads that may not meet subdivision standards today. Will those lose the non-conforming status? Thank you.
No, the cutoff date will only mean that no new lots that are created and put on record after June 30th will later on, years down the road, when the town makes a zoning amendment to increase frontage or area requirements, those lots will no longer be able to go back to this provision and rely on it and say, I don't have to have the new frontage requirement. I only have 20 feet. It was fine before. Now I don't have 50 feet, but I don't have to have any frontage. They won't be able to say that anymore.
Right. The question that's being asked too is that the single lot exemption applies to lots and plans. This person's asking about a private road, and I want to caution everybody that we have a new litigation matter that's addressing this point about whether there's actual frontage in that situation. And I don't want to get into the details of that, but the single lot exemption is not tied to the access that you get to it. It's tied first and foremost to the lot and when it was created. Yeah,
Correct.
So, but I don't want to start speculating on Mike's situation, not knowing who Mike is. Yeah, I wish everybody who's identifying themselves as they're doing here and on Zoom would first name, last name, and your address. And Mr. Bjorklund's kind enough to point out he's not a resident any longer, but if you're not a resident and representing somebody, we'd like to know that too. So anyway, Katie, I'll start with ladies first.
Katie Dugan, 100 Blackmore Road. I guess I just want to underscore with single lot exemption, and it's been raised several times, but I think it's worth mentioning again. We're the only town in the state that deviates from the statute protections under 40A, section 6. And what we're suggesting here is for future lots, we'll cut off a path for future lots to have that exceptional protection in perpetuity. So while we can't change it for existing lots, and I think everybody feels strongly that we should change it for existing lots, we're cutting off a unique exception that Cohasset created for itself. And now because of land court cases can't undo. So I think we just need to recognize it, that the position we're in is an exception, and what we're trying to do is just moderate that exception as best we can for future lots, knowing that we can't repeal it completely, nor maybe we you don't want to repeal it.
No, yeah, exactly. And at the same time, going back to a certain wisdom we had in 1955 when we had a time limit restriction. Sir in the back before, he had his hand up before you. Anything else? No.
Just,
All right.
just for the record, Mike Stevens, 35 Rustway,
Thank you.
just for the record.
Thank you. Steve?
There are a number of towns that deviate from 48 Section 6. And a lot of them do it in conflict with 48 Section 6 because they'll give you rights to rebuild after a 2-year time frame, things like that.
Mhm.
So Cohasset is not the only town that deviates from 48 Section 6.
But it gives it in perpetuity.
And we deviate and will continue to deviate in what's the minimum lot requirement to utilize the exception. We do thankfully require larger than 5,000 square foot lots. But what we believe we had found that we're the only town that's abolished the merger doctrine in such a clear way that the courts have told us we have. And then there's other little deviations that of course can occur from town to town, but
After doing nothing but studying non-conforming stuff for 40 years, this is not a bad provision. It's not going to hurt the people in Cohasset if they're intelligent and protect the lots that are going to be created in the future. It's not going to affect the lots that are here now. So
well,
I think it's not going to hurt anybody. I don't think.
I appreciate that endorsement, I guess.
It's definitely different than what was here a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Yes, well, yes, a year and a half ago, we were talking outright repeal, so. All right, do we have any other questions, comments? All right, so again, what's going to happen going forward is the bylaw committee is going to be meeting Monday the 6th. We always meet on Zoom. Our meetings start at 6:30. We generally do not get a lot of public participation. You're all welcome. We will be going over what we've learned tonight and some of the comments we have tonight and that we've received internally. March 8th, we will be here at 6:30 in this room and on Zoom and on Facebook for the planning board's formal hearings under chapter 48, section 5. To be announced, to be determined yet, we will be going in front of the select board for their endorsement, the advisory committee, and the zoning board of appeals. I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No, I just want to say thank you, Tom, very, very much. Chief Justice Cutler, thank you for your help. Just to clarify for the people in the room, we had a kind of a difficult time a couple of years ago in the zoning, and Katie and Woody did a tremendous amount of work, and there's a lot of confusion. So what the select board has done is take this zoning bylaw standalone committee directly reporting to the select board for a very limited purpose of getting what was done before in a bite-sized piece and getting it passed. And I think that the members have done a very good job. We worked extensively on the work that Katie's committee did. We wanted to make it sure everybody understood it. We took the ambiguity and the confusion out of it to the extent that it was possible. And I think, Tom, you've done a very excellent job, and I want to thank that, and from the select board to thank all the members. And thank people for showing up and listening.
Yes,
Tom,
yes, there you go.
For we had a lot of people here tonight, thank you, and people watching on Zoom, but there'll be a number of people who see this meeting on YouTube after
Yes,
it's done. And so for anybody here tonight or out there watching on Zoom, if there's something that comes up in your mind regarding anything that was said tonight, you have any comments or improvements, if you could please send those along, and we'll get the email address, because I know that's a lot to chew on, and that it can marinate in your mind, and then you go home and say, oh geez, what about X, Y, or Z? So if you had any other comments or improvements that you thought from what you saw tonight, Tom, what is the email, whatever, that they can send to our board or to Justin?
would you like to be buried in emails, Cassandra?
They can email me.
All right, it's cthayer@cohassetmass.org.
Why don't you give them your cell phone number?
I'm not doing that, no, and then my town email is tcallahan@cohassetmass.org. class@ma.org.
It's all on the website.
So, yeah, it's all on the website. You can find me. So again, the schedule upcoming, as I say, you know, we can make changes. Ideally, you want them all done before this goes to the printer. That's, you know, April 1 for a May 1 town meeting. But so there'll be other opportunities for the public to participate with boards and input on this. Everything that we're proposing, the actual warrant articles themselves, and this slideshow presentation, which has side-by-side comparisons of every one of these, the new bylaw and the old bylaw, are all on the zoning bylaw committee's webpage. So please take a look at that, and we'll be making adjustments to them as we need to as we go through all these board hearings. So thank you to the committee tonight for all your hard work, and Justin and Cassandra, Judge Cutler, thank you for being with us. Thank you for everyone out there. And again, if you're interested in hearing more about this, next Wednesday, March 8th, in front of the planning board. Thank you.